Hello, and welcome to this recording of Writing Your Essays at Level 7. This is a session that I delivered specifically for postgraduate students, but if you're an undergraduate student and you've found your way here, some of it is going to be very useful to you. Just bear in mind that some of the examples I might show are a little bit more in depth than might be expected of you if you're writing at undergraduate level rather than postgraduate level. And some of the comments I make about the complexity of research, again, those are aimed at people writing at a level 7 postgraduate postgraduate pieces of work rather than undergraduate. But, see what you find useful. Okay, so I'm going to go through this session. And as you can see here, what I have is a list of hopefully the outcomes that you will have once you've moved through the session. And something that I always say about these sorts of sessions, webinars or online recordings that are being provided for you at the moment, sometimes that means that we consume them a little bit passively because we're very used to looking at our screens, just watching our screens without really actively engaging. And that's something that's very true of the moment because we're distracting ourselves with things on our phones and box sets and so on. So one thing to help you keep focused with this sort of resource, or if you're attending a webinar, is to really try and make sure that you engage actively through making some notes. This makes the whole experience, more positive for you. It means that you then, leave the session with some concrete outcomes. The issue with that is often we're told to take notes, but sometimes we just really don't know what we should be writing down. So one of the things that I advise is when you come into a session like this and you can see these outcomes, you can rephrase these outcomes to organise your notes. So as you can see here, I'm going to be explaining the stages of good essay planning and writing. So what you could do is on your notepad jot down stages of essay planning, and then you could, write down sequentially 1, 2, 3, 4 the different stages I go through. I'm also going to talk to you about different processes in relation to essay planning and writing. So again, you could have a subheading processes, and you could jot down some of the suggestions I make there. So what we can do is create these focus notes, which will be useful in engaging with this. And also what we will end up with is a set of notes and we can review them. And if perhaps I haven't answered some of the questions, or possibly when you review your notes, you think, oh, actually, I didn't really follow those processes, that's a little reminder to maybe go back and review again, or possibly look for some extra resources. So that's my sort of top tip for engaging in online learning. And it's a strategy that you can apply when you do move back into more, traditional lecture settings. But thinking about what you want to get, and you might want to just formulate some questions of your own. Why are you listening to this? What do you want to learn about? And then if you jot that down, that means that you're focusing, you're listening on trying to find the answer to your particular question. So if we move into the presentation proper. First thing I want to talk about is why you're being asked to write essays for postgraduate, assignments. And it's really useful to understand why different assignments are set, because understanding that can really help us focus on how we approach, plan and write them. We just sort of accept that it's an essay, it's at university, but why an essay? What particular skills and what particular approaches are particular to essays rather than reports, for example, or reflective pieces? Obviously, those might be, reflective pieces might be, written in an essay format, but they have a very particular identity. So an essay is really, something that's set for you to show your knowledge and your understanding of that knowledge. And that's really critical at postgraduate level. It's not just about the research that you do, which we'll be coming on to, which is of course critical and important that you do enough research at postgraduate level to be able to approach writing an essay. But it's your understanding, your evaluation of that knowledge, which is really critical in these essays. And, the way that we reach that understanding, that evaluative approach to the information, is through moving through the different activities or processes of writing an essay, and engaging in those most positively will help us reach a better level of understanding of the information and the research that we look at. So what the suggestions I'm going to make today about, putting together or moving through a process for planning and writing your essay, the more you're able to engage with aspects of that process, the more you are developing an evaluative approach throughout the process. We tend to see that sort of evaluation, that understanding should evolve when we start the actual writing phase. And the suggestions I'm going to make to you today are going to show you that at all stages of this planning and writing process, there is a degree of criticality or critical analysis built into this process. So that means as we move through it, we are establishing our understanding right from the very beginning of the process rather than halfway through. And that means that when we actually start writing up, we've already done some of the heavy lifting on the understanding and the critical analysis. So really what you'll be using is a range of academic skills to move through this process and to reach this level of understanding and knowledge and show that in your writing. And what I do when I'm running this as a webinar is I ask people to put ideas about what they think those skills are in the chat box. And if you're looking at this and you attended yesterday, you'll know that, quite a lot of people said, things like this, that, there's a degree of decision making required in this process. Decision making in relation to what you read, what you don't read, what you use, what you don't use, how you use different pieces of research and reading constructively in your essay. And then in order to have reached that point, you will be using research skills, searching effectively, finding good quality and relevant information. And then what we'll be doing with all that research is using our planning skills to review that research and create a clear, constructed, structured essay, which has a logical argument. So to do that as well, we'll be using writing skills, using our knowledge of academic writing style and tone, using our knowledge of language, which indicates analysis, indicates position. And overall, to be able to engage in all these aspects, we will be needing to apply some time management skills and working to deadlines. And at the end of this, I'm going to highlight a time management assignment planning tool, which can be really useful, which helps you manage your time effectively and will take the time that you tell the tool you have and help you apply the processes and ideas that I'm going to go through today as you move through the time blocks that it creates for you. So I will be showing you that. But that's a really key tool, remembering that it's really difficult to get to grips deeply with the amount of research. It's really difficult to evaluate that research and then construct a clear essay if we're doing this in a very time-poor situation. So we need to try to use our time as effectively. And obviously, that might be difficult. One of the reasons that I'm, recommending these tools is that these assignment planning tools allow you to move through this process despite possibly being time poor. They just shorten the length of time that you spend on each stage. So the advantage is that you will be moving through some of the processes that I'm going to go into detail about today, possibly with less time on certain stages if you're writing something up in 3 days rather than 3 weeks. But these tools still help you move through the processes, which still means, as I'm saying, that degree of understanding, evaluation and criticality is developing in each stage of your essay creation process, so that you are going to hopefully produce a structured academic piece of writing which really does show the depth of analysis and understanding that's required at postgraduate level. So I'll pop that in at the end. So just moving on now to structure. Essays have a very clear structure. And when we're writing academically, this is in a way, a form of communication. And we kind of forget that because quite understandably, we get lost in our reading and our planning. But you are communicating through this essay to the reader. You are trying to convey a message. You're trying to explain a perspective. You're trying to create a line of argument. You're trying to develop in the reader an understanding of what you have found from your research. And structure is absolutely critical to convey that message. It works in conjunction with the type of reading that we've done and the analysis of that reading. But if you don't structure your essay correctly, that message gets lost. And no matter how much reading you've done and how relevant that reading may be, if it's not structured to give that message, to communicate the message to the reader, then to some extent all the time you've spent reading and reviewing is lost. So you really need to, think about, as we go through this process, I'll be building in ideas about structuring your essay from the beginning of the process that I'm going to highlight, because it's really critical that we think about how we're building this essay and how this essay will communicate our evaluation and understanding. And this is a really important point, and the real reason I'm starting with this is that at postgraduate level, as you're probably all finding, you're doing a great deal of reading and analysis, and this can mean that sometimes we get a little bit lost in how we actually present that in an essay form. So having our structure in mind from the beginning and showing, thinking about structure as we go through the processes I'm going to outline can mean that we're already thinking from the beginning of our essay planning stages to our writing stage. We're already thinking about structure and we're already thinking about criticality. So really important that structure is really prominent in our mind from the beginning. So just to remind everybody, as I'm sure you know, what's the structure look like? Well, obviously, an academic essay has an introduction, body paragraphs and a conclusion. The number of body paragraphs will obviously vary depending on your word count, the complexity of the question that you are answering. But this is what you are aiming to produce, and this is what we need to have in our mind as we go through this planning and then ultimately writing process. How are we going to create this structure to be able to communicate our ideas? So, one thing I ask people in the webinar is to do with some of the points I've been making as we come into this session, and I've used the word plan and planning quite a lot. And I have to ask people, if they do plan, or, how do they plan? I think people who have attended this session, or if you're just looking at this recording for the first time, it's worth pausing a little bit here to think about what kind of planning strategies you already use or don't use. And it's always worth thinking about how effective they've been. If you do have a planning strategy and you find that your grades are, high enough and you're happy with your grades and you feel that you're getting positive feedback, well, obviously that is an indication that you should continue using those strategies. But what we often find when we start talking about planning with students is that many people start off with very good intentions and then lose their focus on a plan. Or people don't really know what they're planning. Or more often than not, people try to plan, write, read and research all in one bundle of activity. And that's more often on and not the approach people take, which is, sometimes I refer to this as a kind of live writing approach, where you collect your research and then you sit down and say, right, I'm going to write my essay, and you're reading, analysing, writing, trying to structure, trying to connect ideas, kind of all in one go. And you're sort of planning as you're writing. As you come to the end of one paragraph, you're returning, right, I'll start another paragraph now. And this sort of approach can mean that our writing becomes very poorly structured. It means that our paragraphing isn't logical to the reader, so our message becomes lost because we haven't really thought. We've just moved to a paragraph because we feel one paragraph is long enough, or we can't think of anything else to say. Or what happens is that our criticality becomes lost because we're too busy trying to read and understand what we're reading to be able to add in the evaluation that's necessary in a postgraduate piece of work. So if you leave the session with nothing else today, It's to try and build in some elements of planning to your essay writing process. And if you think about any feedback you might have had from your lecturers, if they've spoken about maybe your level of criticality not being high enough, if they've said that they can't follow your arguments, if they've suggested some of your paragraphs are unclear, this is usually an indication that the writing approach that you're taking is actually not working for you. What often happens is we receive that feedback and we think, oh, I'm not good enough, I didn't understand the research. And realistically, what that means is your approach to the whole writing essay process has been a little bit faulty. And it's not that you didn't understand things, but you didn't give yourself enough time to really review and think about what you've read can be, adequately structured to communicate clearly an answer to your lecturer. So if you do nothing else, try and think about planning a little bit more. So, how do we start planning? Well, often when I ask people in sessions, quite a lot of people do some of the ideas or use some of the ideas I'm going to suggest. But if you don't, really good starting point is to analyse the question. And here, I'm not saying read the question, I'm saying analyse the question. This is where we're beginning to build in our criticality. What is the question asking me to do? Often what happens with the question is just we read it 3 times, we identify a topic and then rush off to just collect material. And really, these questions require a little bit more attention, especially at postgraduate level. What's the subject of the question? What's it's about? And what key terms are being used? If you're reading a question and some of the key terms are a little bit vague to you, you've got a little bit of a rusty memory, maybe you missed some sessions, really good point to just go and have a little bit of an overview of some of the key terms, refresh your memory of what it is it's actually about, rather than sort of going, oh, I think I remember that, and rushing off and reading something without a foundation of what it is you're actually reading about. Look at the instructional words. Instructional words are like critically evaluate, discuss. Again, I'll give you a list of those at the end of the session because each of those words has a different meaning. And checking out the meaning of them can really help direct us into what we're supposed to be researching and writing about. And we'll look at an example of that in a moment. And then a really good tip is to look at the learning outcomes of the module. This is what your lecturer is hoping that you will have learned by engaging in the module and the assignment. Remember that assignments are connected to modules. They are there to reflect the learning that that's taken place throughout that module. So what is it that the lecturer thinks you should have learned? And that again can help you focus on what the question is for, what you need to do to be able to write an answer. So this sort of time spent analysing a question is more than just briefly reading it for 10 minutes. It's a process which might take a little bit longer, but by engaging in it, you're already beginning to think about the question critically. And then once you've done that, before you start reading anything extra, what you could pause to do is to just map out what you know about it. Making a rough plan, a mind map, jotting ideas down. What do I know about this? Do I know any key words? Do I know any key researchers? Is there a particular journal or database I think that might be useful for gathering information? Really start building up an immediate picture. And if you're not able to do that, that's fine. That's an indication that at that point, go back to some of those PowerPoints and some of the resources on the Canvas module just to refresh your mind so you can come back into this point again. Because this is the creation of the first stage of planning, and this is your research plan. By analysing the question and thinking about what you know, you're generating keywords and areas to research, which means that you're focusing on alternative search terms, broadening your search, rather than going to Library Discover and plonking in the topic and seeing what happens. We're building a view of what you need to read so that when you're collecting information, you're already focusing a little bit more on things immediately that are relevant rather than having to wade through things that are generally about a topic to find out if they will be useful to your work. And something that's really useful here at this stage as well is to jot down your thoughts. What do you think about the question? Can you formulate an opinion or a claim about the question? A claim is what you think the answer might be, or what you think you want to show and prove within your writing. Now, this doesn't mean that you're locking yourself into an opinion and then you go away and research just to support that opinion. But your initial thoughts, remember that you shouldn't be coming into this cold. You have attended module lectures or done some reading previously, so you should have some opinions and ideas about what this question is asking you. So, at this point, have a little think. That will again help you direct your research, and it may change as you get into the research. Your initial thoughts and feelings about what an answer could be, or what you would hope to show through your writing, might change as you get into the reading. But having a little bit of a think about the topic can, help drive us through our research a little bit more positively, as long as we're keeping an objective approach to research and we're not trying to prove something without taking into consideration research which might not support our line of argument. So this is our first stage of planning. And so what I have here is a very simple question, and what I do obviously in the webinar is ask people to use some of the strategies I've just outlined to break this down. So obviously you could pause the recording here and have a look at it. Which words do you think are important? What have you any initial thoughts about this? If the topic, if you can work out what you might think about it, what are the words you might use to start your search? Are any words or phrases involved in this question significant, so that they might direct you into doing something different? So perhaps what you've come up with is this. Evaluate is our instruction word. Evaluate means assess the strengths and weaknesses of something, or looking at the costs and benefits. Looking at that word in detail is really important. That's really helpful for our research. We know we need to look at research which talks about positive strengths, about the process of globalization, and weaknesses. But then we're moving on. Obviously, I've just mentioned that globalization is the topic. What we might do here is, if you're unfamiliar or you're not quite sure, you might stop and review, get a general feeling about globalization as a process to help you move on with your analysis of the question. But then, remember, evaluate strengths and weaknesses. We're not just looking at globalization. We are looking at the concept of positive and negatives about this process for developing countries. So analysing the question is highlighting to us that our research must focus on this process in a particular area. So that again is helping us think about what we might call limitations of the question, things that we should and shouldn't write about. But it's also helping us build our research plan. And then, as you can see at the people at the bottom, for one student, they've already, started developing an opinion about this, that maybe they remember, actually, I seem to remember we had some lectures where some developing countries have benefited from this process and others haven't. I must go back, maybe review those lecture notes to give me a little bit of a heads up on what some in-depth reading, or, maybe I'm just going to use that idea for my search. But for another student, for you, at this phase, you might, okay, I'm not going to get into research. I'm going to refresh my mind. I missed a couple of lectures, or that kind of went over my head. So building in this evaluative phase into your essay writing is helping you create a research plan. It's helping you come into the further processes in a much stronger position. You're not just kind of getting a general idea and then reading any old thing connected to the topic and wading through lots of things which turn out to be irrelevant, or even worse, spending a lot of time generally reading, say, for example, here about globalization, reaching the deadline of the essay and writing up using that, and then realizing you haven't really dealt effectively with the key area, which is developing countries. So this added layer of analysis is really helping you enter this process much more strongly, better prepared, and is already sparking off in you a degree of criticality about what you might think about this question. So that then means that your question analysis builds for you a research plan, as we've seen. So what I'm going to show you now is an example of a research plan, and this is for a question which is, what is the role of HE, or universities, higher education, in the UK in the 21st century? So again, if you just want to have a little go about question breakdown, question analysis, you might want to pause this here and have a little think about what kind of things you might need to research or read about to answer that question. Thinking about the question words or any limitations or areas you need to be very conscious of if you were going to build a research plan in order to collect information to plan and write this particular essay. So this is an example research plan. Now, don't be put off by this. This is, all lovely colours and various things, and that's just to make it clear to you. At every phase when we're talking about planning, you can do this whatever way you want. You can jot it on a post-it note. You can do a mind map. Some people do, plans like this. It doesn't really matter. There isn't, you don't need to start getting worried about producing beautiful works of art. But, a research plan is a really good strategy to start with to produce those really good communicative essays. So what we can see here is this student has analysed the question. And from their analysis of the question, they've thought about it, and obviously on the basis of probably some lectures or activities they've been engaged in on the module, they've come up with three main themes that they feel are areas they want to investigate in order to write an answer to this question. So they've thought about the fact that HE, or universities in the UK, should have a role which provides personal intellectual development. So these are what students will get out of attending universities personally. This is what they feel universities now need to be able to provide. It's their role to help students foster and develop personally and intellectually. They've also thought that maybe part of the role is to help people develop employment skills, to make people more employable. And also thinking on a wider scale, they've thought that maybe universities need to play a greater role in society, create people who are naturally critical or thinking, and also play a role which helps the development of technology and impacts on, economic aspects of British society. Perhaps also they feel that, universities have a role in helping, society develop understandings of equality and diversity. So this is how this student has broken this down. They've thought about this and they've identified what we could see as three main areas or three themes that they would like to research and quite possibly write about. Now remember, this is a research plan. It might well be as they pursue this research plan that some of these become, less important, or they might actually even identify another theme through their research. But this is giving them a real structured way in to the research. And what we're seeing already is a degree of criticality, a degree of structure that will be applied quite possibly in their essay. And, this depth of thought about the question, building up this sort of plan, is already taking away some of that burden that you put on yourselves when you're trying to read, analyse and review all in the same time period or very close together. You're letting yourself breathe through this process by creating these themes through just analysing the question. And at this point, going back to my initial thoughts earlier about thinking about the conclusion, thinking about what you want to show. So for this student, it might well be that they want to show that these three things are the role of HE, but they might choose to, suggest that, from their research, they think that HE primarily has a much stronger role to play in personal development rather than specifically, society development, because, from the personal, society grows. So what we might want to do is decide whether everything is equally important, or we might decide that we're just going to conclude that all three of these areas are of equal importance in the role. Again, it might change. That's fine. But entering into this with some kind of critical evaluation is meaning that we're approaching research with a critical mindset, rather than just approaching research hoping that research is going to tell us all the answers. Research will alter our perspectives, perhaps, but entering into that research by already seeing this as something which needs critical evaluation is going to help us review things again more critically and evaluate more critically. So, after creating that research plan, obviously we're going to use those search terms to help us develop and create a pool of information research. At this point, what I would say, and I always suggest, is that if you are not sure where to research, if you're not particularly familiar with databases or journals related to your subject area, really good thing to do. Jump on Library Chat, which is still running. Ask for an appointment with your academic liaison librarian. They'll give you, obviously at the moment, you'll give you a one-to-one webinar where they'll run through all the resources that are relevant to you. Every school has their own dedicated librarian who's an absolute expert in all the resources we have related to your subject area. So if you think, well, it's all very well creating a research plan, Jane, but you never know how to find anything, really good top tip at this point, jump on that chat box, say, hey, I'd like to make an appointment with my academic liaison librarian, I'm from this school, someone will get back to you, and that will really push you forward in terms of actually, developing your research skills and also creating, bodies of information for your essays. So once you've found your reading, remember that, you need to constantly read with that question analysis in mind. As you spent the time breaking it down, we need to make sure that everything we read is as relevant as possible. Now, that doesn't mean as we go through that process, we don't read things which we find ultimately we don't use. That's normal. But we want to try and focus. So making sure as we approach things that we think are going to be useful, we look at titles, chapter headings, contents, pages of books. We read the abstracts of journal papers and perhaps the opening paragraphs, the introduction, maybe the conclusion. We're trying to build up a picture of whether some resources are going to be more useful than others, and also identify places within these resources which will be useful. Remember, if you have a lengthy journal paper, you might not need to read all of the journal paper. Looking at the abstract gives you a nice overview, and then you might just want to get into the findings, or you just might want to get into the discussion. So, reading with this, critical reading approach, getting a feeling for what the resources are and identifying, if you possibly can, which parts of those are going to be relevant. If you've got a book, which chapters are relevant, and possibly, look at the subheadings within chapters or subheadings within articles to identify areas. Don't read the whole thing at once. Read, as I said, key sections, and then skim read a little bit more. If you're still not certain after reading an abstract or the introduction and conclusion, you think, oh, I'm still not certain, skim over, read the opening lines of each paragraph or the concluding lines of a paragraph just to get a bigger overview. And then again, doing this means that you're more likely to find readings that are relevant, and also it means that you will possibly find the nuggets of information within those sources which are going to be really, really useful to you. And then once you've done that, once you've identified things that you think you're going to be really useful, we move into our reading in detail. But obviously, if we jump straight to reading in detail, we're going to read a lot of things that are going to not be useful. And this can be extremely frustrating. And often when I'm running this webinar, people often say that they do that. And as I say, it might happen, but you want to decrease the chances of it happening. So once you've decided what you think is going to be relevant, remember, read with that question analysis in mind. You might want to put down your notes in front of you from the analysis of the question. Sometimes I suggest to people that they type out the question and put it in front of them. So every time you read, you know what you're reading for. Set objectives. for the student who's writing about the role of HE in the UK, they might be looking at one paper, they might be looking to see, looking for statistics and analysis of the economic impact on British society of graduates. So that's their objective from that paper. Another paper might be looking at, the mental health benefits for people who've attended higher education. So we're trying to read with a focus. What do I want to take from this? What do I want to find out? And if we approach our reading with this strategy, we're more likely to find the things we want. And also we're more likely to build up a body of notes which are going to be usable and relevant. When we just blindly run into reading, sometimes we spend hours reading something and then we reach the end and we're not sure whether it's relevant or not. But remember, if you haven't gone through that research planning phase, working out whether something is going to be relevant becomes harder because we're still trying to understand the question through the reading and research phase. So we're giving ourselves a lot of work to do. If we've moved that to one side and taken time out to really explore the question and what we're doing, as we move into the reading, we don't have the burden of that, what is it I'm reading about? Is this relevant? Looking back at the question, reading it again. If we've already engaged in that, we're moving through this process much more smoothly. We're applying a strategy which is helping us develop structure. We're applying strategies which are helping us develop our criticality. So obviously, as you've read, you need to, as I've been suggesting all the way through, this process is building in levels of criticality throughout, so that as you actually come to the writing up stage, some of that criticality is already evident in your planning and your research analysis. So remember, at postgraduate level, in order to be able to write critically, as well as engaging in this process, you need to make sure that you've read enough, as I've just commented on in relation to maybe having a appointment to make sure you're finding the right level of sources and range of sources. But if I just draw everyone's attention to the iceberg picture, really worth thinking about this, because particularly true at postgraduate level, the reading phase is a lot longer than the writing phase. So again, this might be a little pause for thought for you if you've come into this session because you feel that you're, needing to develop some more skills in, essay writing. Could it be that you're actually, you're not spending enough time reading and you're moving too quickly into the writing phase? Breaking down the process means that we're more likely to create a structured piece of writing which answers the question. Because breaking down the process means that some of the things we need to do, we're doing in an organised manner. We're not doing that bundling of doing everything at the same time. So what I'm going to suggest here is another phase of this planning system approaching your essay, which is once you've created your notes from the sources you've collected, and remember, I'm using the word notes here. Some people approach reading, perhaps you read something and underline things or highlight things if you've got paper copies. You might use those sticky post-it notes to highlight elements in books that might be useful. And that's a good strategy to start with, but that's not note making. That means that, again, when we move into the writing phase, we're having to read things again. This is particularly true if you use a highlighting process. We often read a journal paper, for example, and highlight things, and we can end up with a beautiful multicoloured journal paper. But unfortunately, when we perhaps go back to that paper, which could be maybe weeks after we've read it, we can't remember why we highlighted things and we have to read it again. In order to make notes, what we might do is combine a number of systems. So you could highlight and then annotate. So right next to the highlight, what it is you've highlighted, why it might be useful for the essay, or write a question that particular section has prompted you to think about. And then we use those annotations to create a set of notes based on the source. this means that we are really actively engaging in a critical reading process. And if we move this on a little bit more to this suggestion of using a reading grid. A reading grid means that once we've collected our research and our notes of that research, we start applying a critical thinking process to how that research is going to connect together and build the structure of our essay. So this is quite a detailed grid. It doesn't have to be this detailed. You can add or different elements relative to what you're writing about. So basically what we've got here is that we might jot down who wrote it, and that can be significant, especially if we're looking at a particular writer or theorist. And then we look at the topic of the paper or the piece that we're reading, the chapter. And that's really important because we might look at things which are perhaps not necessarily written about our topic, but contain elements that are relevant to it. So that can be very useful when we start writing up. And then we might jot down what the key idea or theme from this source is. That helps us focus on what exactly it is we've read, and also helps us start thinking about some of the further columns about how we're going to use it. And then here, strengths, weaknesses, limitations. We're thinking critically. Is this piece of research robust enough? Can we use it? If we're going to use it, do we have to highlight that possibly there are some limitations to this research? So if we're talking about the role of higher education in the UK, we might come across some research, say, focusing on Australia. Well, that's outside our remit, but that doesn't mean necessarily we need to ignore it. We might use that information to offer a suggestion of how higher education or universities in the UK, what role they could play by comparing and contrasting with some work that's been done in Australia. But we would need to point that out in our writing. We might actually look at something which has, gives us some very interesting ideas, but the research was very small scale. It's a pilot study. It might be something that's a little out of date. We think about the strengths and the weaknesses because we'll need to incorporate that into our writing. And then we begin to think about how we're going to use this. And this is synthesizing our reading, thinking about the connections between the different sources. And applying this at this stage is really helpful because quite often what happens is we do a lot of reading and research, and when we come to writing up, we end up just sort of listing that research without connecting it, without building a critical picture in our writing. And if we build that into this phase here, we're more likely to be able to do that as we actually come to our writing up phase. So we might, in our how to use, we might suggest that we're going to, as in this example, compare this source to another source to reach a critical conclusion. We might actually see that this source is very similar to a number of other sources in relation to its conclusions. So we might decide to use it in a synthesized reference to really support an idea very strongly with a number of references. We might then think of further thoughts based on this analysis. This might be that we need to read a little bit more about another subject, or it might help us think about questions that we might want to answer in our writing. So again, building in this level into our planning and writing is meaning that as we're going through, we're developing structure, we're developing criticality without having to do that all at once at the end. So obviously, once we've created our reading grids or started thinking critically about how our research and reading and how that's going to work together within our writing, we would now move on to this stage of planning. And this is a writing plan. We've previously created a research plan, and now we've done our reading and analysed our research, and now we might build a detailed writing plan. Now, again, how you do this is entirely up to you. You might like to write a very detailed plan. So some people would write possibly the first sentence of each paragraph and list the supporting points and their works, their citations. Other people write a rough plan just on themes, basically, what each paragraph might include. Some people write a bullet point introduction. Some people prefer to start by writing a full introduction and then going back and revising that, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail later. But basically, this is what you need to do. move through the stages. Now we've looked at our reading and research. Are we going to continue with the themes we initially generated through our question analysis, or are we going to add something else? Are we going to take one of those away and add in a different idea? Start thinking now of what we have and how that relates to an answer to the question. So again, you could mind map it, post it. It doesn't really matter, but what works for you. So if you already have a strategy that you use and it's been successful, carry on using it. But thinking about what you're actually going to write and how you're going to structure your essay is really critical to making sure that we're writing good quality essays. So this brings us to the paragraphing in our essays. We're going to look at introductions and conclusions in a moment. But we need to think in detail about our paragraphs. So, as I say, some people like to plan by writing the first sentence, which should indicate the topic of the paragraph, and then jotting down what we're going to include. Other people just write a general point. But I think sometimes, especially if you're coming to this session because you've been wondering how to improve your essay writing, one thing that might help is really doing detailed paragraph planning, really thinking about what you want to put into each paragraph and how each paragraphs might link together. Because, doing this before we start writing up really helps us begin to see the overall structure. And what you might find is that as you move into this paragraph planning, you might see from your notes that you have a possible paragraph that you could use. But as you start looking at the structure of your essay, you begin to realise that actually that doesn't really fit. You might have done some work and you think, actually, that doesn't go there. I'm going to remove that. Or you might start seeing that possibly, thinking about it, you might reorder the paragraphs to see that one thing follows on more logically from another in a different sequence. So again, this is all preparing you for writing and reducing the burden of what you do as you start writing, so that you've already done some of the work on the criticality through reviewing your research, creating reading grids, thinking about connections. You've used them then to start formulating structured plans of your essay. You've reviewed those plans critically to see whether everything, is falling together or holding together structurally. So that means as you start the writing up phase, you're really reducing the burden of everything that you need to do as you write. So if we look in more detail at paragraphing, obviously as you've thought about the order and the themes, you do also need to think about how you're going to present information within the paragraphs. Now you've already started that if you've engaged in using reading grids to see how ideas and research connect together. But also sometimes when we approach this, we think, well, I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to be writing about in paragraphs. This is a style of paragraph writing which is really powerful and really does show criticality. And this also helps us with the planning of our essays and our paragraphs within those essays, because it helps us think about each paragraph as a unit of information rather than us just drifting through our research and randomly starting new paragraphs. So basically the Weed model suggests that within each paragraph, you need to have an opening sentence which tells the reader what your paragraph is about. This is sometimes called the topic sentence. Sometimes, as I've said, people write these in their planning stage. And then what we do, once we've decided on that topic, we fill the paragraph with explanations and examples of this topic based on our research, so that the reader can understand how this particular topic is relevant to the answer to the question. But most importantly here, what we make sure that we do is we add this do section. Why is that information there? Why have you offered me these explanations and examples of this topic? And this section of the paragraph really brings together your research and explains to the reader how all this research is building an answer to the particular question. It's sometimes called the so what. And more often than not, the so what remains in our head and we don't actually write it on the page, because to us, we've become so close to our research, it's perfectly obvious to us why we've written that. But remember, our job is to communicate to our reader. So we need to make clear to the reader why we've written about this, why we've selected these particular references and citations. We need to help the reader understand what's going on in our head. And this is the bit that often gets missed out. So obviously, let's have a go. Let's work it out. What I've got here is a paragraph that's broken down, obviously, by colour into different sections. And on the right-hand side, I'm asking you to see if you can link these colours to these definitions, which sentences are giving us examples, which are showing what we want to do with the information, which is developing the argument, the academic voice, which are telling us what the paragraph's about. So obviously in the webinar, people put these answers in the chat box, but you might want to pause this, read through the paragraph, and see if you can identify what each of these coloured sections are doing before we move on to looking at the answers. So, if you've engaged in this, you'll see we've got an opening sentence where the person, this writer, this student, has started with an example, which is fine, but they've joined that to something which really signals to the reader what this paragraph is about. And it's about using religion as a coping mechanism if you have a terminal illness. And then they've explained what they mean by that. What is, religion? Why is that relevant or useful for people who are, unwell? And then they've supported that with some examples from their research, different religions, to build a picture for the reader on this topic so that the reader can understand what it is they're trying to say. But then they've ended this paragraph with that red section. They've come to a critical conclusion based on the evidence, so that the reader can really follow their point of view and understand why they're making these suggestions at the end of the paragraph. So there's a logical journey through this paragraph. Now, this paragraph can only have been created through planning and thought. It's very well constructed, everything hangs together, and the critical conclusion at the end is supported by the examples and evidence in the main body. So if you think about the strategies you employ to start writing your paragraphs, do your paragraphs need more of an ending, more of a conclusion? Do you need to make sure that as you're using examples and evidence that you can see the connections between examples and evidence so they can work together to help the reader understand what you're trying to communicate? Or are they just a little bit random and you can see that they're about the same topic, but you haven't really seen how they can work together as well as they could within the paragraph? So this is what we're aiming. And this is what we're thinking about when we're going through this planning stage. This is what we need to actually produce in our writing. So this is what we need to bear in mind as we're thinking about how we plan our units, our paragraphs. I'm just going to pause a little bit and talk a bit about this idea of academic voice. Basically, what often happens, and I'm going to show you an example, is that, as I've said previously, we might do a lot of research, but we don't really apply that research as effectively as we could to an answer to the question, to our answer of the question. So what we have quite often is that we use the ideas or possibly quotations, words from our resources, but we don't spend time integrating them to explain to the reader why they're there or how they're building an argument. So what we often end up with is just lists of research, and the reason they're there is not always clear, or the reader has to work very hard to work out why they're there. And this means that we're not really developing our own academic voice because we're just offering other people's research without that added evaluation and analysis of how we think that research can be used to answer the question that we've been set. And that's why that weed paragraphing process is really powerful in helping us do that, and really powerful to bear in mind as we plan our paragraphs. So if we go back to that paragraph we've just looked at, look at it again without that end section. It just stops. We've got relevant examples and explanation, but we haven't really got a conclusion. We can see that this student has done a great deal of research and has thought about that research, but we can't see what they think or what conclusion their analysis of this research has led them to. And remember, people often talk about being worried about giving their opinion. Your academic voice or your analysis of arguments is built on evaluation of good quality academic research. It doesn't spring from nowhere. Remember, we haven't written this essay directly after just putting together a research plan. You have engaged in an academic process of research and evaluation. And therefore, the conclusions that you're coming to based on that research are academic. And as long as you've connected your outcomes, your conclusions to the research effectively, then they're supported. But if we don't put that in, we're just offering research. And all we're really showing here is that, hey, I can read some things that are relevant, but I'm not going to tell you how they answer the question. Or if we start putting in ideas and opinions which aren't supported well enough. So if we come to a conclusion based on faulty research. So if we go back to that reading strategy and we think about strengths and weaknesses, what we're doing there is allowing ourselves to think about how we need to be cautious about using research and how we can use it as long as we might address its limitations. So then we might use it, but with caution. So we might say, well, this research would suggest this. However, it must be borne in mind this is a very small sample and it took place in Australia 20 years ago. So what we're offering is cautious analysis, cautious evaluation. We're showing our voice. We're showing that some conclusions could be made that are relevant to the answer of the question, but we are accepting that some of the research may be not strong enough to really support that. So if we've gone through that reading grid stage, we've allowed ourselves to review that. We might reject some research on that basis, or we might look for better research. But again, that means that what we're doing by engaging in this process is that we're building criticality and we're building, moving through a process which is building to the writing up phase with much more idea of what we're actually producing in that phase. So you might want to pause here. I just want you to have a look at this paragraph and think about some of the things that we've spoken about already. Talk to you about weed paragraphing, making sure that there's clear opening sentences which indicate to the reader what the paragraph is about, which we're able to do through planning and evaluation before we write. That we present information critically, showing how it connects together, how it might be synthesized together. That we draw critical conclusions based on the research and evidence that we offer in our paragraphs. So I'd just like to look at this paragraph and think about what the topic is, what's the student's argument, what are they saying by including this information. So, as you've probably seen, the previous paragraph was very difficult to work out what it was actually about because it was missing an opening sentence. So we kind of jumped straight in. It was sort of like the students had taken us swimming and pushed us in without giving us time to put our swimming costume on. We just jumped straight in. So we were already at a disadvantage trying to work out what was going on. What's this about? So there was no clear opening sentence, which obviously, as we can see in this better example, this has an opening sentence. So we can see immediately we're looking at groups and what makes groups effective. And what we can see here also in this better example is that the student has actually synthesized some of these references. So we have a synthesized reference immediately, which indicates that the student has spent some time reviewing the sources and seen that these two different sources say the same thing. So that means that they're able to present a point with a synthesized reference, which gives it more strength. So that shows criticality, it shows critical thinking. It's also making their writing easier to read. There's greater flow. We can see where they're going. And as they move through, we can see that they're building up evidence and examples within the paragraph, and then they're coming to a nice critical conclusion that whatever the terminology is used, because they've talked about the difficulty of terminology, is that, this is a problem for groups in relation to group size. So they're coming to a critical conclusion that group size is a problem. So what we're thinking about here is organisation. So what we're thinking about is how we take our research and we move that through into a clear, organised units, clear, organised paragraphs. One thing you need to do is, as you've created your plan and you've moved into, writing up, as you write each paragraph, just review the question again. Make sure, obviously you've gone through a planning stage and you might have rejected some concepts within the planning stage, but as you move into the writing stage, remember that you're still writing with the question in mind. Make sure that it's connected. Make sure that everything is clear. So, you might want to write a couple of paragraphs at a time, have a short break, read them and review. So always constantly writing with our question in mind, that we don't just abandon the question and start writing up without applying it to the question. Again, writing with the question in front of you, writing with your initial question evaluation in front of you can really be really powerful in helping you do this. So, obviously, in our essay, we're not just thinking about how ideas connect within paragraphs. We need to also connect our paragraphs together. And this is really critical, because quite often what happens is we just jump from one paragraph to another and we're not really showing the reader how they connect. And this means that our writing lacks flow. And again, we're asking our reader to see the connections. So using language like this can be a very powerful and simple way of connecting everything together. So, referring backwards and forwards as discussed above, as will be discussed in later sections. Using this sort of language to help the reader see how different points connect together and how we're moving from one paragraph to another, or within a paragraph, how we're showing the relationship between our ideas, that we might be comparing and contrasting, we might be moving on to another point, we might be drawing a conclusion. So making sure that this sort of language is also evident between our paragraphs and within the ideas within our paragraphs. Manchester Phrase Bank is a very good resource for this. Again, I'll add that at the end. So obviously thinking about, how we move on. So, for example, before proceeding to examine this thing, it will be necessary to do that. So before we examine the impact of the process of globalisation on developing countries, it's firstly necessary to define what is meant by globalisation. In order to assess the role of universities in 21st century UK, it's firstly necessary to, outline the higher education sector within the UK. Then we move on. So thinking about language to help us connect things as well. So as I said earlier, obviously, when we're planning, we need to think about what we include in our introductions and conclusions. Often we kind of forget this. Introductions tend to get a little bit more attention than conclusions. But if we include them in our planning process, they tend to come out better and be more powerful and more useful to our essay. So what we're going to look at here is what we're aiming to write in introductions and conclusions, because knowing what we're supposed to produce for each section in an essay can really help us plan it, because if we don't know what it's supposed to do, we don't know what to plan to include. And then also ultimately means that we're going to use that plan much more powerfully to write up. So if we just have a look at this introduction. And again, you might want to pause this, have a look through. What's this introduction doing? What are the elements of this that we can see? What kind of jobs are each of the sentence doing to really start this essay as powerfully as possible. So you might want to pause and just have a look, see if you can identify what each section of this is doing. So this is what you might have seen when you reviewed that. This introduction is focusing on what the essay is going to do very clearly from the beginning. It also includes some really useful background to the topic. And it's not huge, it's not overly long, but it helps the reader move into the analysis, because this is an essay about, employee relations policy. And then what they've moved into is some, information which helps us understand the significance of that. And then finally, we can see the structure that they're going to use. So we already know the structure of the essay. So if you're thinking about this as a planning tool, when you're planning your introduction, you'll need to think about what you're going to write about in your body paragraphs and the order. So for some people at planning stage, they actually just jot down the order that will become, part of that signposting sentence. You might want to drop in, possibly in the planning stage, a little bit of reminder of maybe some background information, which sources you might want to use for that. Sometimes in introductions we need to define terms. So again, you might want to jot that down. And remembering, obviously, sometimes our introduction, if we write it first, and then we do review some of our paragraphs, even though we've planned, we decide that we're going to move them around or maybe delete them, remembering that our introduction must signal the content to the reader, so we need to go back and adjust the introduction accordingly. So what we can see when we're thinking about planning, we need to make sure that our introduction contains these elements, that it signals the content of the essay to the reader, that it might contain some relevant background to help the reader understand the context of the question, that it addresses the question. So if we move on and look at this conclusion, again, pause this and have a look. What elements can you see? What is this conclusion doing? What are the different roles that the sentences are playing in this conclusion? So here, what we can see is that they're going back to the question. They're going back to the main points that have been discussed, that they signalled were going to be discussed in the introduction, and now they're mirroring that by showing what they've written about. So at the introduction, they tell us what they're going to write about, and in the conclusion, they tell us what they have written about. Notice they haven't gone into lots of detail. We need to be wary of not rewriting the essay again in the conclusion, but they've evaluated the themes. And then ultimately what we've got here is this nice persuasive statement. So on the basis of everything that they've written about, they're saying, they're coming to an analytical, critical conclusion. And, they're saying, therefore, has been shown to play a critical role. So they can only come and use that sort of powerful language if the content of the previous essay supports that conclusion. So be wary. Make sure that every conclusion that you reach has been supported. And again, when you're thinking about planning, these are the elements you need to show in your conclusion. So this is how we draw it together. Just to recap, these are the elements that you need to show in your introductions and your conclusions. So as you're planning, these are the elements you need to think about including, and remembering your introduction needs to signal the content of the rest of the piece. Remembering that your conclusion needs to mirror what you've told the reader you're going to write about in the introduction, and then what you ultimately did write about. Making sure that your conclusion actually concludes, that it doesn't just stop, that you leave the reader with an overall sense of finish and also an overall argument or point. So, what we've looked at so far, we've gone through different planning processes. We've thought very much about how we build in criticality and develop structure through those processes. We've looked at what it is we're going to ultimately write, the style of writing we need to employ, and how that knowledge will help us with our planning and also help us when we're actually in the writing phase. And what we have here is just a little checklist. When you've finished writing, you can apply this. Is this what your essay looks like? Have you got these elements? Have you got clear paragraphs, nice opening sentences? Is everything within the paragraph relevant? Have we got those nice finishing, concluding weed paragraphs? Have we linked everything together with some of that signalling and transition language? Have we shown the relationship between ideas clearly within our paragraphs? So this is what we need to check. So I've covered a number of different points about, planning and processes in order to help you create, really good quality postgraduate essays. I'm going to be posting this. If you are reading it, there is a session run by my colleague Rianne on synthesizing and paraphrasing, which works very well with this. So if you're looking at this today, it's running today, so you might be able to jump on. But obviously, most of you will be looking at it after that's happened. But Rianne will have posted the link to that in her resources. So I would highly recommend you have a look at that as well, because that's going to help you with some of the more detailed elements of writing. But thinking about some of the things I've covered today, what you might want to identify is, some or all of the strategies that you think you might start using. And remember, with any strategy, the first few times you start using it, you might feel a little frustrated. But everything that I've suggested here is based on, real knowledge and understanding of how essays can be built and structured. And it's really worth just taking the time to work out which elements you might need to employ to make sure that your essays are, as clear and structured as they can be. So, as I said, I'm going to add a little slide at the end, which includes a link to the assignment planners and the Manchester Phrase Bank. So I hope you found this useful, and remember that you can book a one-to-one appointment with any member of the academic achievement team to go through your writing individually, so we could have a look at it to see whether you are planning and writing effectively. And look out for further sessions related to academic writing as well, which will be useful. And also on this Canvas module, there's a huge amount of resources related to other elements of academic writing. I hope you found this useful. Thank you.